Okay, so welcome to this seminar on technical standardization and innovation. And then the byline is, will EU and Sweden be squeezed into geopolitical frictions? Question. That was the title. So my name is Enrico Diacco. I'll try to moderate this 1 hour. And I'm a research director here at Entreprenörskapsforum. So once in a year, we usually publish a report called Swedish Economic Forum Report. Try to pick a theme that is interesting somehow, and then we try to get external authors, sometimes also internal authors, to write about it. And this year we chose a large theme that is mainly based on geopolitical questions and geo-economic responses, and how that might affect innovation and entrepreneurship in an interconnected world. So big questions, 6 authors, 2 editors. Basically, that's the book that came out of that. We launched it in December, having a little of a party, then without any of the authors actually present. And we said that we should actually invite them here to Sweden, basically. And Tim, you're the first one that we're inviting. We're going to have a series with not all authors, but at least 3 or 4 perhaps. And you are a research fellow at the German Council of Relations and have written extensively on today's theme on standards. Okay. And when I spoke to Tim somewhere in January or something like that, he's kind of muttered, you know, do I have to come in March to Sweden, basically? I said something like, well, the weather is usually good. Yeah.
It was perfect in Gothenburg today.
Yeah.
Sunshine. You started.
Okay, but it's like this at least. The purpose today is to dig deeper into this, you know, really interesting issue on standardization and innovation. And we framed it in 3 questions. So why are technical standards becoming of strategic importance to innovation? Should EU act to be a global standard setter? Are Swedish actors slow in adapting to tug-of-war in standard setting? That was the 3 basic questions that will go the red theme through the whole presentation, and also my questions, basically. We published, actually, we took out the chapter and published it into a separate report somewhere, and you can download it. And we also asked Håkan Jonsson to write a comment, a critical comment we asked for, and he got a critical comment, I think, and a good comment also, an interesting comment for actually discussing all these issues. Besides Tim, we have the panel, and a knowledgeable panel, and it's Annika Andreasen, correct, exactly, yes, CEO, Swedish Institute for Standards, Håkan Jonsson, Senior Director and Partner at Halvarsson & Halvarsson, which is a communication and public affairs advisors, you could say, but you also have a background in standardization since you were the Assistant Director General of the National Board of Trade, where standards are, of course, important. And then we have Kristina Weinicke, so policy expert, intellectual property, the Confederation of Swedish Industries. Okay. As usual, questions can be put on the chat. If there are a lot of questions, we'll try to stay 5 minutes longer after close at 1700 p.m. We'll see how we do that. I like to have, of course, questions also from you sitting here live. Great. Enough of info and background. Tim, 20 minutes. Is that okay? Sure. Great. Welcome.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the kind invitation, also for the opportunity to write this chapter to this really exciting book, and to be the first one that you invite to Stockholm. That's an honor, and I'll try to fulfill the expectations. It's good to be back. I've been based in Sweden for almost 4 years, so it's great actually to be back here in Stockholm. I'll not lose any more time and go into the paper, introduce that to you in the next 15 to 20 minutes. And then I think I've already seen Håkan's remarks. I'm really looking forward to a controversial discussion. I think there's many points that are not so controversial between us, but I'm looking forward specifically to focus on those that are controversial, because I think that's what brings probably most clarity to the discussion. We discuss those that are to be decided here. So you already see the first slide up here. So I'd like to start with a quote from EU Commissioner Thierry Breton, who said, "Technical standards are of strategic importance. Europe's technological sovereignty, ability to reduce dependencies, and protection of EU values will rely on our ability to be a global standard setter." Now, compare this with those of you who have been covering technical standards for a while with how we used to think about standards. I think if Thierry Breton had been saying the same thing, say 3 years before, or say, let's say, the conservative, let's say 5 years before, I think I'm not sure even he had heard about technical standards as being something political. So I think it's a quite remarkable shift of an EU commissioner attaching a quite ambitious and political agenda to technical standards that have not been the case before. Well, if that's a good thing or not is something probably to discuss, or in what ways it is problematic and in what ways not. But I think what is important here to understand for those who haven't been studying technical standards forever is to understand what that actually is and why it's so counterintuitive to think of technical standards in political terms. And this is because technical standards are, well, technical in nature. That's why they're called technical. So they have technical specifications that are being agreed upon to provide basic safety and interoperability. So the fact that I can use my phone and connect not just to, say, a router in Germany or from one supplier, but also when I come here to Sweden, that I can use my phone and still use the same phone to connect to the network, but also very simple things that we all have the same keyboard, that we all have a A4 size of a paper. All these are technical standards. And I think these specifications were mainly, essentially, I think, to support competition, to support the interoperability, the compatibility of products and technologies, and were not sort of seen so much. I mean, they were subject of competition, but I don't think they were sort of seen in the political light shed on them here by Mr. Breton. And I think they're particularly important also in these times, not just because of the geopolitical context that's glued to them, but it's also when you consider the digital transformation that we are in, where interoperability, where interconnectedness becomes so crucial. I think this is also part of the story why they are extremely relevant. So how did they become so politicized? I mean, for the deeper reasons, I'll elaborate in a second, but mostly I think to the European discussion, I think two reportings were essentially quite important to understand, were quite instrumental to become so politicized. One was the issue of lithium battery standardization, the other was new IP. And in both cases, a new IP protocol for the internet. And I think in both situations, the European policymakers, including the European Commission's perception, was that they apparently had missed something and that maybe the system was broken, which I think it's not as broken as they may think, but in fact, something had happened. The Chinese have appeared more prominently, and I think the Chinese are a bit a different type of standard setter on the global scene. So I think it may be worth sort of reviewing to what extent they pose a challenge to us or not. So the question here then was, if China is somewhat a challenge, if China is there and the European system may or may not be broken, how can we sort of adapt to these new conditions without, I would say, adopting the Chinese practices? And I think finding the right balance between adapting to geopolitical conditions, but also not giving up the strengths of the system that we have and not adopting too much to Chinese practices is probably what we will be discussing most today, but also in the coming weeks, months, hopefully not years, hopefully not decades. On the next slide, and I'll promise I'll be a bit quicker here, otherwise I'll go over my 20 minutes. let's maybe just briefly sort of have a look at sort of the context. Where did all this sort of politicization of technical standardization come from? I mean, it is part of this broader ambition here between the United States, the broader technological rivalry between the United States and China. This idea that globalization, a flat world where interdependence is essentially an important element to support cooperation, avoid at least forceful conflict. I mean, there's always different positions, but these are sort of replaced by this idea that one could just review dependencies, see how one could best maximize dependencies that others have on yourself and how to reduce your own strategic dependencies. Something that I think Farrell and Newman have rightly coined as weaponized interdependence. So trying to think how to make best use of existing dependencies. In the technical standards setting field, as I said, it's maybe a bit counterintuitive how technical standards would fit in. But if you look at that, I think the United States, China, and as well as the European Union have certainly put this put technical standards into that context. I've just listed here 3 documents, one upcoming that we can still speculate what it will all be about, the American New Emerging Tech Standardization Strategy that the National Security Council will put out. But by the very fact that this is drafted by the National Security Council, now based on the input of NIST, the Public Institute for Standard Setting in the United States, but still it will be finalized by the National Security Council, I think gives you a little bit of flavor of what this will look like. I think of the 3 documents listed here, it will be the most explicitly geopolitical one. This is to come, I think, this year. There were rumors that it should come out in February. Now turned to be in March. It's not out yet, but I think it's going to come out soon. You also have a standardization outline from China. It was not just published by the government. That would be like the normal or the institution that would normally publish such a document, but also by the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. That is sometimes publishing very technical documents, but I mean, I don't think you could have gained much more prominence and much more political weight within the political system of China for such a document. And third, a document that I won't go into detail because I'm sure it will be subject of controversial discussion here today, which is the European Union's standardization strategy that the European Commission has published in February 2022. Now, why is it counterintuitive? I've already touched a bit upon this. Well, technical standards are voluntary. They're not binding. They have enormous force, but you don't have to apply them. So why bother so much about something that's voluntary? They are, as I said, technical in nature. They're not explicitly political texts. So why place so much political emphasis on this then? They are following more inclusionary logic than an exclusionary logic. Yes, you have patents involved in technical standards, but then to bridge sort of that gap of inclusivity and also sort of the exclusive character that patents normally have, frank terms, so specific licensing terms have been to bridge that gap so that you can exclude standard essential patents that you need to use in order to comply with the technical standard. They're really inclusive. So why in this geopolitical logic that tries to squeeze out others, why really use technical standards? And I think it's also important they are primarily written by private actors, not states. So in that sense, this is also a question, why would states then use it? Well, part of the answer, I think, and an important part is China. And if you look at the next slide, what is important here is China has a state-centric, not a state-controlled system of technical standard setting. Also, we can go into details here in the discussion. If you sort of historically look how China's standardization system evolved, I think we need to be fair and sort of say China has sort of become more liberal, less state-controlled in the standardization field. This, frankly, has also made them competitive in the first place. If it had stayed fully state-controlled, I think China would not be a significant player on the international scene at the moment. But if you look at the numbers, China has, with its model, grown a substantive clout in international standard setting, be that at ISO, where I think we see a steady, but I think still limited growth of Chinese influence. I just gave here one indication. I think you need to actually pull together quite a number of metrics to get a proper understanding of how strong or influential China is or not. And would also say China has sustained an enormous and even higher impact in the International Telecommunication Union. So there are some international standardization organizations where China's influence is far higher than in others. But I think what we see is a consistent effort from the Chinese and a consistent investment of the Chinese side to get prominent there. But we also sort of see the spread of de facto standards. So standards that China has developed domestically or specific companies are using in China and exporting them through projects that are not least also part, in many cases, of the Belt and Road Initiative, and happy to discuss that further detail as well. Now, how is China's standardization approach different? I mean, it's successful, all right, or has at least limited success, depending then on where you look, more in ITU than in ISO. But I think what is important is it has a two-tier system. So it still holds one tier domestically that is fully state-controlled. Fully state-controlled, not meaning that there would be no private actors involved, but it's sort of still under existing state institutions, state agencies, state ministries. But you also have a private tier that is sort of new, where associations, industry associations develop technical standards in China. But if you then go a bit deeper, also talk to both Chinese and foreign actors participating in that system, you find consistent reporting about sort of more informal ways of party-state institutions sort of influencing also the so-called private tier of technical standard setting in China. Now, China has started also to externalize this, a more state-centric approach. It has done by various means, both in terms of formal standard setting, but also in terms of de facto standard setting. And when I say state-centric approach, again, I mean, there is significant leeway for private actors also in the Chinese system, but the party state has sort of is constantly deploying certain means to have sort of steering function or to influence somewhat the direction of technical standard setting, not the details, the technical details itself. In what ways is that important? On the next slide, you find sort of 4 dimensions that I think why this is important politically. The 4 dimensions that I differentiate here is economic, legal, security-wise, and ideational. And I think what is important here is that, so the idea behind this sort of heuristic is more to think about how does my influence in technical standard setting actually translate into power or influence beyond the technical standardization field. Some of this is not new, some of this is very familiar, others may sort of come at least more to the front lines and be more important recently. On the economic front, I think what is important is the distributary effects that increasingly have always come with technical standard setting, but increasingly come with that because ICT standards have a relatively high rate of being patented. ICT, just for the sake of the digital transformation, becoming inbuilt in so many more products, which simply has sort of an effect that the distribution of technical standards and its underlying patterns is just becoming much more present. And that raises issues about pricing. I think we also see a contestation at the moment who is able to set the prices as well, where these technical standards, where disputes over technical standards and SEP, so standard essential patterns, pricing is being spelled out. The Chinese, yeah, we can go into details about that as well. And it's if you lost sort of a course, you may also need to adapt your product to the existing standards to remain interoperable. So you can gain by pushing through and implementing your own patterns into existing standards, but you may also need to adapt if you're unsuccessful. On the legal front, that's not really new. There can be extraterritorial effects, I think, from technical standards. So say IKEA tries to sell the same product worldwide. So it wants to comply with one IKEA standard, if you like, that is also then compliant with all the technical standards from the major markets around the globe. So if you say as the European Union or China are able to set a particularly tight standard or something, and IKEA would still want the same product that is being sold in China also be sold in Europe, then it probably tries to apply the technical standard that's the tightest that provides market access to all the markets. So it may have extraterritorial effects with the technical standard you set. Also, international technical standards serve as a reference point in the technical barriers to trade under WTO law. The security aspect, I think, is quite important because technical standards create markets. So if you have a global standard, you also tend to have a global market. But if this is rather, if you have different standards in different geographical areas, it is more difficult to transit from one to another, which may come sort of with technological lock-in effects. And having done a bit of research in a few fields, this may be a sort of a niche phenomenon, a very important one, you find that if these are very crucial technological dependencies, lock-in dependencies, they may also translate then into narrowing your options politically, because you may feel you can't go against the political core interests of a country that you absolutely need, because you can't just switch supplier for a critical infrastructure. There's also maybe also a direct security angle here, but this is maybe a bit more complicated. We can discuss that. And finally, the ideational element. I mean, technology is never value neutral. If you use it, you can, if you design it in a certain way, there's always other options. They may also serve other political goals. And by that, if you are able to set technical standards, I think it's a very effective sort of discrete way of conveying certain values. I mean, we don't question the technology that we use every day, but to what extent is it protecting privacy rules or not? We don't question that every day. We just develop new technological products based on those technical standards. So in that ways, in sort of indirect ways that we're not always conscious of, technical standards are always sort of social institutions and shaping our expectations of the world that is surrounding us. I think I'm running a bit out of time. So am I?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So you have 3 or 4 minutes.
I have 3 more
5.
minutes.
You can even have 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, but so the last slide was sort of saying a bit about sort of the way forward. The paper also includes a couple of ideas how to develop an answer to sort of this ongoing politicization. I think there's 3 risks from current developments. One is politicization, because I mean the existing system, the non-political system, has served us at least quite well. I don't think that the question whether we want to politicize the system or not is so much a question or an option. It's so much optional anymore. I think it is existing. It's more the question how we deal with that. But it is a challenge also that it could further politicize. To what extent is it going further to politicize any further? Second question, and I think that's related to it, is the question, are we seeing further fragmentation of the existing system? So I don't think it's as simplistic as to say there will be a US or Western-led sphere of technical standards and a China-led sphere of technical standards. I think this will be very much dependent on product. It may also not always that clear that it's bifurcating so that there's 2 camps. It could also split into even more spheres in some cases. So I think that's sort of the tendency that different actors with coming sort of with political implications coming with sort of political interests that they want to set own standards or spheres of influence, I think, may also lead to a fragmentation. And that, I think, is an enormous risk. Because if you think of it, if you innovate further and you have sort of a standard that is globally, you also may be able to invest more into that new innovation. You just simply say, well, the market opportunities that open up if you have a global market are so much bigger than if you have just a tiny market to develop for. The revenue that may come back, that you may invest at least in research and development is so I think fragmentation is a real threat to the system. It's not just a political issue. And third, I think from a Western perspective or from a European perspective, the power shift element, I think it is quite natural to some extent. China has become more innovative. Whoever is more innovative will also have more say in the setting of technical standards. But of course, given sort of the 4 dimensions politically, this is something to consider and to think sort of how we can be placed as best as possible in the existing system to lose as little as possible. So as I started saying, I think we need to adapt but not adopt. So we need to adapt to these new realities, but we should also be very careful in not politicizing it further or not taking over sort of a steering a system where you have mainly political steering of technical standards. I think there is consensus. The question is, where precisely does that balance sort of lie between adapting to the politicization and also not politicizing it further? And I think, to me, the high-level forum that the European Union has installed, I think needs to be made a success. And I leave it as broad as this for the moment to discuss with you what that actually implies. I think like-minded coordination will be necessary. It's happening to a degree already as part of the Trade and Technology Council of the United States, but I think that is something to really look into a bit further. I still feel that many political actors don't understand technical standardization enough. So I think we also need to invest here in the knowledge, involve different stakeholders to really sort of, that policymakers also understand where may their role lie, but where may also be the limits of their role. I also think that sort of transparency and fundamental values need to be embedded more clearly in technical standard setting, as China is a very different animal politically with different values. So this is probably also something, I mean, we may all not hear at once, but I think how this is precisely being done, whether we put the burden now on companies to sort of take care of this, what role is there again for public policymakers? This is, I think, again, another very tricky question, but I think we need to find ways here. Corporate with China based on reciprocity, I think this is important. I mean, China could also just decide to leave the existing international institutions. So engaging the Chinese and finding ways to engage them on as most favorable terms as possible from our view, I think is very important. But reciprocity, I haven't been talking so much here about sort of lack of access for foreign companies to the Chinese system. So that is, of course, also an issue. That's where the reciprocity term comes from. And finally, we need to sort of far beyond sort of the China challenge. I think we need to think, how can we create an ecosystem here in Europe that is as conducive as possible? The technical standard setting, how can we preserve that? How can we preserve the strengths of the European system? That's mainly our homework, and that will be sort of broad and detailed enough to discuss also for another several hours, I guess. But let's stop here. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Tim. I was just, 1 or 2 questions to you. Have you seen an example of a fragmented standard already that was basically pushed by China, for instance?
Yeah, so one example that I find very interesting, and I've been looking into that, I mean, there are quite a number, but let me point to one that I find politically particularly interesting is in the field of digital railway signaling, where you can see how China has there is no international standard, but so far sort of the European norm, the European standard and the US standard have not been so dissimilar. So for a country to decide, say an African country, if it decided to build out its signaling system, even if it opted for one, it was still relatively easy to later switch to the other supplier. China has come in with a quite different signaling system, which it spreads in Belt and Road projects, where the funding comes from Chinese state-owned banks. They have been deployed in a number of countries where actually the recipient countries now realize, oh my God, the signaling system was built by a Chinese state-owned company. And in the decades to come, if this is to be maintained, if this is I want to further build out, I mean, I don't want to have 5 different signaling systems in my railway systems, right? I mean, this is to communicate with one another. I will probably always need to go back to this one state-owned enterprise in China, or another Chinese supplier maybe, but not a non-Chinese, because this is significantly different. And I've also talked to the respective European companies and US companies, and I said, so if I came as an Asian or African country, these are the 2 continents where they already used. So if I came to you and asked, so could you sort of reverse engineer the Chinese system? Could you help me maintain it just for me to remain independent from a Chinese state enterprise? They said, well, we can reverse engineer, but this is so costly, we rather suggest rip and replace. So that will be cheaper. That is, of course, an example of the lock-in effect also that I referred to.
Thank you. Okay, I asked the panel to come up here. It will be a little crowded, but I think we'll manage. You do like this. Okay, that's good. And then rules are basically, don't always wait for me to push the rule. It should push the question. So if you find something that Tim says or Annika says, try up with a hand and I'll try to monitor basically. But okay, everyone is ready. Yes, great. First question. So I will structure my questions in these 3 broad themes, basically. Why are standards becoming important? Why should EU act as a global standard setter? And then what should we do, basically? Are Swedish actors slow to adapt? And I put a few questions right. But first, the first question, and then you, in a typical Swedish way, you only have to say yes, no, or maybe, or something like that. Right? So the first question is basically, is standard setting getting more politicized? Yes, no, or maybe?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Yes. Okay, that's what I want to. The second question is, again, no, yes, or maybe, is the new technical standardization strategy that the EU is developing. Is that the way to go, basically?
Not really.
Not really?
Yes.
Yes?
Maybe.
Maybe?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, you see. So there will be a good discussion about this. Yeah, great. Okay, so the first question is, and a bit, I want to know a little about, has standards become more important, in the digital area compared to the, the area before that? You can develop your answer and more.
Yes, and I would like actually to start with something a bit more of a background and something that you highlight in your chapter, and that is the voluntary nature, because we often talk about standards as they are being voluntary, but in fact, that can be sort of not questioned because they are voluntary if you compare to legislation. But they do have a very strong effect, especially in the digital world, because we do need the interoperability. To give some examples on that, we have the public procurement, which at least within the EU, standards have been really important in building the single market, because you use standards when you're working with public procurement. So that is one part. And to give one example, if you are going to participate in a bike race, and then you can say that, oh, the standards on the geometry of bikes, those are voluntary standards. But if I would come to the bike race with my triathlon bike, they would say, it's the wrong geometry. I wouldn't be able to start. And if I did start, I would be disqualified. So we have a voluntary standard, but it does have legals. So that is number one. The second one is that Internet of Things and other developments are creating sort of a convergence also of the importance of standards. So where we do have seen the disputes between Apple and Ericsson and Samsung and Ericsson on the standard essential patents and the brand. But we also see discussions now where EU are going to present new rules on standard essential patents. Then the discussions are not just between companies within the same industry, but suddenly you have discussion between different industries because you have toothbrushes that have apps, and you have the automotive industry that is connected. So that is...
So it's much more complicated.
It's absolutely more complicated.
What do you say? Do you agree?
Yeah. If standards is more important now than before, I would say no. I think that we wouldn't be where we are today if standards wasn't really set during the industrialization. So we have taken leaps, and I think we are in a leap now. Very high technology evolution, then they are important, but it's not more important than it was before. And I think in Sweden, we are relying on the position we actually took during the industrialization. After the Second World War, we actually took a position in Sweden within standardization, which actually hold us still on the 7th place globally, if we look in driving standardization's work. And that's because of what we did after the Second World War. So but we still, it's important when we have this technology leap, and then we need to be ready to actually take the place to set the standard. We have been relying on other countries. Europe has been relying on other parts in the world. So we have been not keeping up with the position we once had. And I think that's kind of a wake-up call that we are sitting there now and looking around us and see what's happening. And another thing which I think is important for Sweden is that we have been trusting in other nations outside Sweden. We have outsourced, and when we have outsourced and put production outside, we have not taken responsibility for that technology development in Sweden, and that it becomes in China and in India and other countries that actually drives the standardization in those areas, and we lags behind.
Yeah. We're coming back to that question, of course, how and how much we're lagging. Do you want to comment on my question, or?
Well, yes, I would like to add the fact that I think standardization as such is not an end, it's a means. And it's a means to things that are important to us, like growth and research and innovation and getting our values secured. And in that sense, I have a harder time understanding what standardization is about in the digital era, because it's, let's call it, it's less tangible, but it remains the same basic functioning in the research and innovation cycle. And I would argue against your bicycle race analogy and say that, in my view, I think you would be right if it would be illegal to start the bicycle race with the new bike that you're coming with that is a bit different from the ones before. But I would say standardization more often plays the role of not making it illegal, but having a burden of proof to show that you are living up to the same expectations. And perhaps not illegal, but impractical to have a totally new version of things. But if that new version is indeed so much better that you hope it is, then that burden of proof and that impracticability is worth it. So in a
short comment on that, very short.
Yes, I published an article some years ago on standardens rättsliga ställning, and it's really complex if you look into court cases and so on. So it tends to be more legally binding than it seems.
Tim, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, your initial question was, is it becoming more important or not? Yes, I'd still say yes. but still, somewhat agree here because I think, I mean, if we, and I think you quoted in your comment to the paper as well. I mean, every €4 that is being produced as revenue can be traced back to a technical standard. So if I say it becomes more important in a more interconnected world, this is not to say that it has ever been unimportant. So I think we tend to, I mean, apart from the standardization community, I think we tend to overlook really the value of technical standards in the past. But by trend, if we get in a more interconnected society with sort of the convergence of standards into even more industries, I think by trend, the importance may even increase further, but it is already so crucial that, I mean, I can also go with no. It's
Okay. Well, a follow-up question on that. Who owns the standards, owns the market? That, you know, is that true in a digital world where everything is happening so quickly? Still need standards?
I definitely think you still need standards. Of course, the development pace is quicker, it needs to be quicker because the pace of evolution of things is much higher. But of course, it's important. I was thinking when you talk the railway example, I mean, we have had that situation with the mobile phones. I mean, it's actually the same thing. We have this signaling system that they didn't work together, but now we have one. And we managed to do that. And Europe won at that time. Perhaps Europe is not winning at the signaling of railways, who knows? But it's actually also there a consensus discussion that needs to take place. So.
And Europe won that one, but we're still struggling with the 20 and 24 containers standards set in the US and not really functioning for European bridges and railways.
So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to add the complexity of digital innovation and products that are interconnected. So therefore we see the disputes on standard essential patents between Apple and Ericsson and Samsung and Ericsson and so on and so on. Because we see as customers, we see one iPhone, for example, but in fact you have several hundred different patented inventions in one phone. So the complexity is also a factor.
Okay, you were waving or?
Yeah, but I just would like to add, I think you mentioned in one of your slides, the advantages of standards and the economic is there, the distributory effects and the adaptation costs. I would add to that standard also has a huge impact in the corporate behavior. So if a company has invested billions of euros in developing a new technology, of course, they want that technology to emerge as the winner. And the other way around, if somebody else wins the race for the standards in an area where a company is very active in investing, they will change their behavior. So in a sense, I think what this should be about is perhaps not that, as I said before, the standards is not an end, it's a means. It should be about what does this mean for growth, for research and innovation, for let's say, advantages in our view of what's important in way of life, on environment, on gender values, etc. That's what standard policies should be about.
It's more money involved compared to the past, or
I think it's more money involved. I'm not sure, but of course everything is going up.
okay.
I just want to comment on that because I fully support and agree, and I think that's why it's so important that all companies really is engaged in standardization all the time, not when they have the product ready. They need to be there to follow and actually put forward their proposals to align with their production and the product development. So I think that's the most important thing. And I think also that's a little bit what we have seen. We are lacking in Sweden, in especially new areas. We have not engaged, we don't have the industry engaged in the standardization in the digital era.
If we conclude this session, standards are really important and getting more important compared to the historical. But you know, we have been climbing the learning curve and learning hard lessons. Okay, great. So another theme is, okay, that's most important actually. Why should EU act as a global standard setter? But I will first perhaps start with the question, we have had an era of self-regulation, basically, if you can say that in the standard CGR. So what was good and what was bad with that, if you compare to the challenges now? Huge question. Who wants to start? Christine.
Yes, I can start. I think one of the advantages with the way we have been working with standards in Europe is the bottom-up perspective, so that the ones wanting the standard, they pay and they contribute, and they are sort of really engaged in the process. There has been issues with that, for example, the SMEs and the consumers that have not really had access to that process. But I think that is something that has been really positive. And what EU should do is to make sure that those positive things are still used or enhanced in some way. So we don't have this sort of top-down standardization, because I don't think that's good in the long run.
Okay. Annika?
I just want to comment because I think in Sweden we definitely have the consumers involved in standardization, and I think it's between 60 and 70% of our participants in Sweden are SMEs. So for in the European perspective, we are good in Sweden. I just want to say that. But of course, I fully agree. We have had a bottom-up standardization in Sweden, but I also think if we would like to make changes going forward that is more coordinated, I think a top-down approach is a complement. And I think that's why it's good to actually set the direction. Here we need to actually, here we have a space which we don't cover, where we think Europe needs to be. And then I think we need to find a way to have a top-down and a bottom-up and make them meet. That's what we are working on in the standardization system. I'm also Vice President for Technical Standardization in SEN. So that's on our top of our mind. How do we meet the top-down steering with the bottom-up and make them meet and contribute?
Mm-hmm. But the bottom-up system would also include some kind of centralized legislation on standard. Would you approve of that? Or if I understand it correctly, the strategy will also, if you adopt an EU strategy, it will also be legislation about that. A law, something we should. If I no, that's good. That's okay. I read that in your book, in your chapter. I thought.
No. There's a. So there are regulations that regulate the development of harmonized European norms. So norms that the European, so to simplify a bit, so if the European Commission is enacting a new regulation, it sort of sets parameters that are, of course, legally binding. But then the question is sometimes how to implement that, and a regulation doesn't necessarily go in all the details. So then the Commission may say, well, this is something that standardization organizations that bring together industry, consumers, so all sorts of stakeholders may be better equipped to essentially develop a technical standard supporting a certain regulation, a certain legally binding document. And there is a regulation, actually more than one, I think, that is sort of regulating this precise process of developing harmonized European norms. And this regulation has been amended earlier this year. We can discuss whether that's good or not, but it won't be sort of a completely new standardization law in Europe. So it's an amendment to the existing regulation. And I would assume that we all agree it's good that the regulation exists. Whether the amendment is correct or not, I assume that we have maybe slightly different positions at the table.
I read your papers, and there was some, fine details there, basically, about this issue. Yeah,
I think so. I think Europe has been hugely served by this division of labor that Tim and Annika are mentioning, that the politicians, when they face the voters, they should be able to defend, I set the bar at the right level for safety and consumer protection and etc. Whereas how that was achieved, the contents of the standard, I didn't care about that. I didn't try to steer that because that's best done bottom up by the industry themselves. And one more beautiful aspect of bottom up is that the result often fits industry in general better. So a European standard has an advantage over a Chinese top-down standard because it's easier to replicate. It often resonates better with what the typical engineer on the development in the research and development section of a company is thinking of. So in a sense, better results. Everyone does what he or she is best at. The politicians take the responsibility for the general level of protection, but the standard institutes and the industry behind them are the ones deciding what should be done.
Tim, do you agree? We
Yeah,
want to qualify it.
So in general, I agree. I don't think that sort of the level of disagreements starts sort of at this general layer. To me, the question here, and I think that's sort of where I somewhat fit in between appraisal for the bottom-up approach and the call for more top-down. The question, so in an ideal world, before standardization got into this wave of politicization, I think, of course, the bottom-up approach was the most efficient. And so in an ideal world, I would, of course, subscribe to that. The question is, what happens if an actor that apparently has a combination of still having private actors driving a lot of technical standards, but with a very strong state steering and with plenty of state resources? That doesn't just mean sort of investment in the development of standards, it also means coordination among stakeholders of your own country. How do you react to put it very simply, if you don't have an even playing field anymore? If one actor has adopted tactic that, at least to this degree, weren't there before, and that comes with a state-led agenda. And then the question is the bottom-up approach sort of still fit to meet this new challenge? And that's where I think the top-down comes in. So I want as little top-down as possible to meet the challenge that China, frankly, among others. I mean, I'm a China scholar, so I'm focused very much here on China, but you could also discuss what type of standardization animal is India and so on and so forth. We could go into that as well. I'm not an expert on this, but looking at China, I want to amend as little as necessary, but I still want to be effective in sort of meeting the challenge that China poses.
What's the German position about these issues? Short.
So the short answer, they don't know. So you talk to different. I mean, and I think the reason is the Germans have been. I mean, look at it. It's more complex than that. But if we just take ISO, IEC, the two main international standardization organizations, as a reference of strength of countries, then with Germany has been immensely influential in the existing system. So of course, there's a lot of stakeholders which have a lot of stakes in the existing bottom-up system. But if you go to the government level, if you talk, for example, to Franziska Brandner, the state secretary in the Ministry of Economics and Climate Action, certainly the leading house in those questions, I think she has understood very well sort of the geopolitical challenges and that they have to meet. So it depends a bit on whom you talk to.
In the February strategy from the Commission, are they clear about the benefits of the self-organization process, or if we know EU, they will grab a lot?
So if that's directed at me, I think we have because I think we're interpreting the standardization strategy a bit differently here at the table. To me, I think it depends. Maybe we don't have the time to go into all the instruments that are proposed and all the strategies here, but let's maybe pick up two elements and that may strike maybe a good balance here. One is the higher level forum for European standardization. I think it's a very good thing. To me, this is sort of a new forum that tries to bring together a wide range of stakeholders. And in the ideal case, I think what we are going to see is that the bottom-up approach is sort of informing policymakers about what standardization is all about, while policymakers sort of can say, so we are concerned about a few things, please take them into consideration. And if you don't, for maybe good reasons as private actors, this is maybe exactly where we as European states need to step up and get more involved in standard setting, which is always, to me, the default option, the worst option. But there may be issues where we say, okay, this is not in the agenda of private companies. We have understood that as public actors, so we need to be there. And public actors, by the way, have always been part of international standard development. The second, just very briefly, the second institution, and that I think may cause sort of more of the concern here, is the so-called Excellence Hub that will bring together experts from across the Commission to discuss, to pull together knowledge on technical standard setting. So as long as it stays the way I described it just now, as our interpretation is of that, I think it's fine. But if that develops into sort of a secondary organization in-house in the Commission to develop technical specifications that replace existing technical standards, then of course we are in the Chinese approach of a top-down thing where public actors make standard, and that should be avoided. But so far, the Excellence Hub does not that.
Okay. Annie?
I can just comment on, because I fully agree with you, and I think it's actually up to all of the countries within Europe to actually meet with the top-down initiative. Because if we don't, I think the Excellence Hub might take on and say that now, okay, if you don't do it, we develop technical specifications instead.
Yeah.
And I have a very fresh example of that, where the Commission came to the standardizations organization last spring and said, we have seen during the pandemic, we need production material for vaccines and
Protective.
medicines and vaccines. And we have not been able to engage the industry in this. So the industry is not engaged, but they still see within Europe a need for standards within this area. So what will happen then? I think we will have a technical specification. But then I must say, Sweden did a great job in this, setting up this, because Sweden actually made it possible for a technical specification to become a standard when the standardization bodies can actually collect the parties that needs to be collected to develop a standard. So that's perfect, because we can now transform the technical specification and see them as a pre-standardization and end up in a standard instead. So I think that's a good thing to know.
I have one more question before we go to the last thing, because time's running. We only have 3 minutes or 4, 5, 6, something like that. We'll go over a bit. Is that possible? Yes, I think so.
This is so fun.
Yes. Is there, this top-down approach, is there a risk, is there a risk for smaller countries to, get squeezed into this process because we are small, we don't have the, stakes and the resources and whatever? Is there a risk?
Yeah, of course there's a risk, to be honest, but the opposite is worse. So I think to be able to engage, we have a transparent system. It's all there. You can actually see what's happening. So I think it's definitely better to have this standardization system than the opposite.
So everyone agrees, Håkan as well? Or
The thing that worries me about top-down is actually the quality. I think the quality of the standards, the end result, how well they work and how well this will lend them to be copied by others, that stands to gain from having a more of bottom-up approach. And of course, you can introduce top-down elements, and they are better introduced when it comes to the totality of the system rather than going into the content of the standard. And they are better served if you are using them really, really carefully in very select areas. So I'm not just against going top-down, and of course it's necessary to have a strategy overall for the whole ecosystem that you call it. But if you try to go into the content of the standards, then I'm very worried. That should be done by the industry itself.
okay.
For the sake of just having also controversy on the panel, I mean, I think I agree with 95% of what you said. But I think that also the content of technical standards can be a political concern. So whether certain privacy issues are being protected or not may be more of a concern for a public actor than for a company. So I think questions of, say, encryption is touch upon sort of security issues that are a concern to some degree also private actors, but there can be sort of cases where public actors have a say. So again, I mean, I think I agree with 95%, but there may be these few cases that I think need to be properly identified where we may see sort of a divergence here. And that's, I think, where public actors already get involved today, I'd say, and should also get involved in the future. And there may be a few more now that China is becoming sort of more present in shaping more of the standardization.
Very short.
Very short.
Extremely short.
I just say we have had the top down before. We have got standardization requests. With HLF, I think we can now have a total view of what is coming top down, because that we didn't really see before. So I think we have a good approach to reach that. And I just want to say another thing as well. The standardization strategy is also a way to handle Brexit. We shouldn't forget about that.
How to standardize leaving the EU?
Christina?
No, I just wanted to add one more thing to add to the complexity, and that is, you know, what should the authorities do. For example, we do have the panel as we speak in WTO regarding FRAND, for example, and I think that is a really good thing that we should get involved in, because there is a dispute on how can you take these issues forward, and you need to have systems working for that, and that's definitely something the public.
Okay, well, we have one more, important theme here, in 3 minutes or something like that. Are Swedish actors slow in adapting to the tug-of-war in standard setting? That was a line I stole from your paper.
Yes.
Are we? How? Or why?
Why? I think perhaps we forgot about standards, and you mentioned also knowledge about the system, and it's some way evaporated, I would say, or disappeared in the I would say very much the big organization that has been driving it. And what I said in the beginning, just we actually, Sweden was very good in after the Second World War in setting standard, but we forgot about it through outsourcing and cultural economy and so on.
Are the politicians aware about these issues? Or?
No. I would say almost completely ignorant.
Okay. What should we do?
Well, I'm a PR consultant.
Hire him.
How did you do it in Germany? Have you done it?
I think there's a few politicians in Germany being aware, and this week, I mean, the near future will prove whether that's enough or not. Frankly, I thought that, again, here, the high-level forum had a good idea by sort of, at least in the beginning, it said that should be at ministerial level once a year. I think that would have forced ministers of economics at least once a year to have a readout to prepare something. Even if the minister still doesn't understand anything, at least his team needs to engage somewhat. So that, I think, maybe that may be instrumental. Again, as I said, I mean, I can only reference her again. I think Franziska Brandner, who is the #2 in the Ministry of Economics in Germany, has a very good grasp of that. So that is sort of the light of hope. And frankly, it may be enough, we will see, because at the same time, there's also not much pushback from other politicians. As long as you don't understand it, and as long as it's not on your agenda, you'll probably not push against someone. So maybe it doesn't need so many politicians, as long as they properly understand it, as long as they're powerful enough to drive it forward and determined to do so and then actually achieve something. So that's going to be successful, I think. Near future will tell in June.
Do we have some questions from the floor? Yes, Tristan.
Yes, thank you very much. I just more a couple of comments. First of all, I'd like to pose the question: why is standards being politicized in a global or geopolitical, geoeconomic perspective? It's just one question, and to me, it's basically about complacency. Swedish companies, as is Annika, as you say, we were good at this 60 years back in time, since the 1980s, completely left that and quite a few other things behind. I call it the Ericsson phenomenon. Basically we said China will never be there, meeting our standards, etc. And they are. And by the way, I've been working in China for 20 years, among other things, with these issues. To kill a few myths.
Not a long lecture.
No.
Okay, great.
Yeah, he knows me. Top-down approach. Public or government or government agencies in China, they're basically not standing setting institutions. Those are the tech entrepreneurs. That's how policies are being formed and formalized in China. I've been working through that system practically hands-on as a professor at one of their universities. And last, Sweden do not compete for the EU when it comes to technical standardizations with China. There's 4 different provinces. And for the very last comment, what we see very clearly in some of the more advanced industries in China, those we would like to compete with, they're actually changing their view on how standards works. It's becoming more and more an idea of merging with the standards from, let's say South America, Brazil. Depends on the market. That, of course, is being used as a geopolitical tool. But, we have to be aware of that China is not always what it looks to be. I mean, there are a lot of details that we are quite unaware of. And if we do not look into that, being complacent, seeing things as we believe it is, we will basically be a bad word.
Yeah. As Christina said, as you started, it's a very complex, absolutely very complex. And it's a good, comment. I can close the seminar. I'm of Italian descent, so I never, know about the time and stuff like that, basically. So, but we can start, we will have a little drinks afterwards, and the discussion can go on basically. But I thank you all for coming here. It's a fantastic subject and a fantastic topic, so interesting and so important and so under-researched and undervalued to a certain extent. Thank you, Tim, for writing this. You have been putting in a good paper here to discuss basically. I see that there are some from Foreign Ministry. You should read it basically. That's good. Okay, so thank you for all.
Thank you.
Thank you.